Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this IIASA NERC webinar on biodiversity from a systems perspective. We're delighted to have so many of you joining us today. We've got quite a packed schedule with speakers from IIASA, from the UK, and from people who have feet in both camps. Therefore, we're going to start already as people on time so that we can move things along in a timely fashion. If you have any questions, there will be time for some questions at the end, hopefully. And if not, you can put some questions in chat, and we can also carry on the conversation afterwards via our platform called Yasser Connect. So once again, welcome to everybody to this seminar on biodiversity from a systems perspective. I will hand to the first speaker, who is Albert van Jaarsveld, the IIASA Director General, to give us an introduction. Over to you, Albert.
Thank you, Ian. And from my side, also a hearty welcome to everybody. Wonderful to see everybody online. And this is a great occasion to discuss biodiversity from a systems perspective. I'm going to give you a quick introduction and a few slides about IIASA. IIASA is an international research institute based in Austria and the village called Luxembourg, just outside Vienna. And we focus on multidisciplinary and transdisciplinary research that addresses some of the global and universal challenges that we all share. And this is the space in which we function and operate. So please, if you haven't been here, come and visit us in Luxembourg at the Schloss where we are housed. Now, systems analysis helps decision makers to find long-term and lasting solutions to some of the complex and interconnected challenges they face. Today, countries face complex and interlinked problems that have to be resolved. And these global problems generally cannot be dealt with or solved at a national level and requires multilateral cooperation and engagement. Systems analysis uses in-depth analysis and many tools such as mathematical models, scenarios, and integrated assessments to try and resolve these global challenges. And systems thinking untangles multiple interactions and focuses on identifying key trade-offs, feedbacks, and synergies to try and avoid unintended consequences that may emerge if we take a siloed approach towards solving these complex problems. IIASA is a member-driven organization, and all these members are committed to advance the field of systems analysis, to apply systems analysis to complex problems that require an integrated, scalable, and neutral approach, and build a global network of scholars and practitioners dedicated to systems analysis as an approach to solving scientific problems. Of course, IIASA is well known for many of the models that we run and operate at the institution. The strength of IIASA is not only the breadth and the scope of the models that we have, all of them tend to be multidisciplinary, as you can see, and problem-focused. But it's also our ability to get these models to talk to each other and speak to each other that is one of the strengths of the work that's carried out at IIASA. And on top of that, our ability to integrate these models within a broader population or economic context gives us added value in terms of what we can offer scientific decision-making, but also policy decision-making at the end. So we've launched the new IIASA research strategy with its 7 research themes that have been integrated into 6 new programs. And some of the new research foci that are prevalent in the strategy is our focus on just societies, new economic frontiers, and of course, biodiversity that we'll be talking about today. We're also focusing more on large-scale interdisciplinary research projects together with our member organizations, and a clear focus on capacity development and to continue to serve as a hub for science diplomacy, something that IIASA, of course, is well known for historically. Our research groups have been reorganized to deliver on the new strategy. There they are listed in front of you in the middle: biodiversity and natural resources, advancing systems analysis, energy, climate and environment, population and just societies, strategic initiatives and economic frontiers. Each of these research programs are organized in a number of research groups. Today we'll be focusing on the biodiversity and natural resources space, and there are 4 research groups in that program: biodiversity, ecology and conservation, water security, agriculture, forestry and ecosystem services, and integrated biosphere futures. Similarly, for the other established research programs, and of course the new research programs are still evolving their research capabilities in particular areas. But I'd encourage you to go look at our website and explore some of these research groups and find some of the areas that you have a particular interest in. Of course, today we're talking biodiversity in particular, and please consult our website that is on this particular slide if you want to just find out a little bit more about IIASA and about our operations. So Ian, thank you very much. I'll stop there to give us more time.
Thank you, Albert. Thanks for that introduction. For our second introduction, we have Claire Simmons from UKRI Natural Environmental Research Council. Over to you, Claire.
Thank you, and thank you, Albert, and thank you very much, IIASA, for organising this event. As Ian said, my name is Claire Simmons. I work at the Natural Environment Research Council in the UK, and I am the secretary for the UK's national member organisation to IIASA. And together with NERC, with the Economic and Social Research Council and the Engineering and Physical Sciences Research Council, we form the national member organisation to IIASA. Unfortunately, Sarah Webb, who is UK's IIASA Council member, is not able to be with us today, so you're stuck with me. But we really hope that this webinar will provide an opportunity for UK researchers to understand a little bit more about what IIASA is and what it does, and to start to form some of those connections with IIASA researchers. And thinking about those connections as part of our membership to IIASA, IIASA is an eligible research organisation for NERC, ESRC and EPSRC, which means that IIASA researchers can be co-investigators on funding opportunities with these 3 research councils. So please feel free to email me after this event if you want more information, or you can also connect with me through IIASA Connect, which you'll hear about a little bit later in this webinar. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Claire, and thank you very much on behalf of IIASA for all the support that UKRI provides to IIASA, and we were delighted about the opportunity for our researchers to be co-investigators on NERC, ESRC and EPSRC research calls. So now the next part of the agenda, we're going to look at, take a perspective on IIASA biodiversity research. And this is going to start with a short presentation by Piero Visconti, who is the research group leader for the biodiversity group at IIASA. Piero, over to you.
Thank you, Ian. And thanks everyone for joining us today. So the work I'm going to be presenting today is actually the contribution of several people within the Biodiversity and Natural Resource Program at IIASA, and I can't possibly be extensive and inclusive about all of the work that has been done in 7 minutes. So I'm going to give you a flavor and encourage everyone to visit our website to know more about our work. I start with a rather complex diagram because system analysis tackles complex issues. You don't have to look too much at the words there, but I chose this dipster diagram to show just how many topics that related to biodiversity IIASA been earlier working on in red from a system perspective, and how many new emerging topics have been researched at IIASA in the last few years especially for what concerns looking at biodiversity patterns and processes from all different facets of biodiversity, and how these are being connected with the social, ecological, and economic systems. To give you a flavor of this work, I'm going to start with this publication from David Leclerc, which probably you are very familiar with. David led a group of over 40 researchers to look at how and what kind of transformative changes we had to embark on to bend the curve of biodiversity loss across many biodiversity facets, including population abundance, local, regional, and global extinction risk, community composition, biodiversity turnover. And he coupled expertise from integrated assessment modeling, land use change modeling, as well as ecological modeling. And what he found is just what kind of changes in production and consumption had to happen to bend the curve, as well as the more traditional kind of activities that we are looking at as ecology and conservation scientists, which have to do with how we manage land use through conservation and restoration activities. So this is the kind of pioneering work using system analysis that we expect IIASA to be leading on, but crucially, these have relied on collaboration with many different research organizations, especially from the UK. Looking more at conservation and restoration, in this other work led by Martin Jung at IIASA also, he has been investigating the question of how can we harness synergies in managing land use for conservation across the 3 Rio Convention. So the objective of this work was to identify which 10 or 20 or 30% of land that need to be managed for conservation to minimize the extinction risk of vertebrate species, terrestrial vertebrate species, as well as plant species, and maximizing the amount of carbon that is stored above and below ground, and the amount of clean water that is supplied to people across all major hydrographic basins. What he found is that there are extensive synergies between the 3 conventions, and efficiently managing 30% of land can yield very large positive results across all 3 environmental assets. And now one last example of how we've been using system analysis at IIASA. This has been work led by Rory Gibbs, at the time a PhD student at University College London in Kate Jones' lab. What Rory did is investigating the risk of spillover events of Lassa fever, an hemorrhagic fever endemic of West Africa, from the wildlife host Mastomys natalensis to humans. He developed a mechanistic model that was able to unpack and model separately the 3 components of risk. Hazard, which is the prevalence in terms of abundance of the wildlife host in the environment as a function of land cover and land use, as well as climate. Exposure, which is function of the density of people in close proximity to the rodent and the rodent itself. And vulnerability, which is the likelihood of exposed individual to develop a severe symptom. And in this case, it's a function of a proximity to hospitals, as well as in future work, disaggregated and spatially explicit poverty estimates. This has been a very interesting study in the sense that it uncovered many aspects of this nexus issues with land use at the center of it, which have to do, for instance, with food security, as well as climate change mitigation and biodiversity conservation. And one of the key findings of Rory's work was identifying which diagnostic centers here in triangle, where are they placed now, where they should be to be able to detect Lassa fever in the future. And in bright green, you see actually where the increasing rate of spillover events will be highest, which is away from where the diagnostic centers are. As I said, I gave an overview of some of the work we've done so far, but there is much more that is in the pipeline for what concerns the modeling of direct and indirect drivers of biodiversity change and its interlinkages with biodiversity change. I refer you to the work of David Leclerc. notable information here is the work that he's doing with, for instance, University College London and Europe WCMC, looking at transformative change through sustainable supply chains and trade governance, and how these affect different environmental aspects, and not just biodiversity. And also was asked to make a plug for the Scenario Forum, where David is hosting a session. The deadline for submitting abstract is today, so you still have time to submit an abstract for this event if you're interested. The information there, or you can email David directly. Lastly, in terms of perspective activities, and I want to mention that we are not just looking at advancing on the driver's side, but also looking at ecological feedbacks to biophysical and economic modeling, IIASA. On the left-hand side, you see several acronyms that might be obscure to you, but essentially are different modules of the integrated assessment and modeling platform of the Biodiversity and Natural Resource Program, IIASA. Each of them model different human activities, both in terms of economic aspects as well as biophysical aspects. And many of them already have a dynamic and bidirectional connection with each other. And now the new kid on the block is IBIS, which is our new integrated species distribution modeling framework. And in the future, we are expecting to build a series of ecosystem service model, for instance, looking at how pollination affect crop yields, and so connecting a mechanistic model of pollination with EPIC. And we are already envisaging several collaboration with UK partners in doing so. This was my last slides, and thank you for your time, and I'm looking forward to discuss more on all of this.
Thank you very much, Piero, for that quick introduction to some of IIASA's biodiversity research. We have a second perspective on IIASA biodiversity research. This is from Gagana Daskalova, who is a Schmidt Science Fellow, again in the biodiversity group at IIASA. And I'd like to pass the floor to Gagana. Please, over to you.
Thank you very much. And this will be my first time presenting as a member of IIASA, so I'm very happy to be part of this institution. And in my talk today, I will be telling you about humans and biodiversity, but not in the places that you might usually suspect. And I'll be talking more about how humans influence biodiversity when they leave. So humans are changing the world so much you can see it from space. But I want you to forget about the cities and about the bright lights and instead focus on the dark spots. And many of those places have had human influence. And in many places, there's been agriculture, human settlements for centuries. And now those places are increasingly getting abandoned. And abandonment of land, abandonment of entire human settlements matters because that also will change ecosystems. It will also change biodiversity. And currently, we don't really know exactly where this abandonment is happening. So in ongoing work, we found that on European scales, if you look at the instances of land abandonment, they're becoming increasingly more common. And so here you can see a map that shows that over the last 10 years, abandonment has doubled across the European Union, and you can also see that there are bright red hotspots in mountains, including also in mountainous regions of Austria. So abandonment is happening. It's happening at increasingly high paces, and this is a process that innately involves both humans, sociological systems, and nature. And what I did together with my colleagues to see how land abandonment is influencing biodiversity is to combine this information on the land cover and the land use with details of species abundances over time. So each point here shows a place where scientists have monitored the abundance of birds or mammals over time. So that combines two different databases. And I think, yeah, that's kind of an example of, I think, an approach common taken by IIASA scientists, and that's the combining of data from multiple sources. And a brief preview of the results is, so here on the y-axis, you can see population trends. So whether a given population is increasing or decreasing over time. And overall, we found that if you have more abandonment, you have more increases in population abundance. And this was particularly true for carnivorous birds and also for herbivorous mammals. So from this, we know that, yes, abandonment is happening and it is influencing ecosystems. They're becoming increasingly woodier. It's influencing the abundance of species. But this is just abandonment of fields. And what happens when we look beyond the field? And in many places around the world, we have entire ghost villages, places where the houses, the entire human structure, the roads, everything has been abandoned. And these processes will likely continue to increase as the projections are that more and more people will live in cities. So the question that I'm working on as part of my fellowship at IIASA is essentially what happens to biodiversity after people leave. And a brief preview is an example here from Bulgaria. And so on the map, you can see all of Bulgaria's villages. And essentially, almost every single village is declining in human population size. And again, there are hotspots in purple in mountain places. And so we see this really big shift, and essentially we're living amidst like humanity's greatest ever migration from rural areas to cities, and that's changing the natural world. And yeah, there are over 250 fully abandoned villages in Bulgaria. And my hopes as I continue through my fellowship and my work at IIASA is to extend this to global analysis and look at more and more countries. And to influence some of my hypotheses, I've also tried to use like information from previous research I've done. And essentially that shows that when you take global change, the impacts on biodiversity are not always what you might expect. So in previous work, I've looked at how forest cover change influences biodiversity change around the world. And here the common expectation is that after forest loss, you're gonna have species declines. But instead what we found was that when you look across 6,000 sites around the world, we found that forest loss intensified both the gains and losses. So there were more increases and there were more declines. And forest loss was this catalyst of change in terrestrial ecosystems. And if you flip things on the other side, when you have abandonment, usually you have forest gain. But will the effects of forest gain be only positive, or will there be negative effects as well? And that brings me to this wider systems look at the countryside abandonment, not just the fields, but of entire human settlements, and trying to link ecosystems, society, biodiversity, and I'll be using information from multiple disciplines, which I think again is very in tune with the IIASA vision, and trying to link insights from ecology, but also sociology, anthropology, and then remote sensing data and the earth sciences. And yeah, so I'd like to leave you with the message that the ecosystems around the world are exposed to many different drivers. They're not usually the ones that are, sometimes they're not the ones that we talk about the most, like land use change, we talk about it a lot, but it's not just about the conversion of forests to fields, it's also the reverse process as well. And all these drivers together will be reshaping our natural world. And I look forward to seeing what my collaborations at IIASA and more broadly, the scientific field finds out about global change and biodiversity. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Gagana. Very interesting presentation. I wish you all the best at IIASA, and I hope it is also a catalyst of change for you and your work. There's a question in the chat that you might want to have a look at too, Gagana, to answer. And so we're going to move on to having some short perspectives on UK biodiversity research. And it gives me great pleasure to pass the floor to David Edwards from the University of Sheffield. Over to you, David.
Thank you very much. You can see that? Perfect.
Yes, yes.
Well, following on perfectly, I think, from Gargana's talk, I'm going to be thinking about some of our work on making space for restoration in tropical forests. And I'd like to thank everyone for inviting me to present some of our work. So the Bond Challenge seeks to restore 350 million hectares of the world's deforested and degraded lands by 2030. And so that is going to be delivered through forest and landscape restoration, which is a key component of meeting the Paris Agreement. And what's going on? Here we go. And governments and international NGOs are pushing this FLR agenda. Now, the question that I'm really concerned about in our research is, what is the value of this FLR agenda for biodiversity? So there are many different ways you can restore a landscape, but probably the most likely to occur across much of the tropics, at least, will be natural regeneration, because it's free. You just take away your degrading source, you leave your landscape with time, and ultimately we're going to have some restoration. So we want to understand what the benefits of that for restoration. I'm going to talk about some work we did across Colombia, focusing on cattle farming and abandoning those landscapes and seeing how they affect birds and dung beetles. And our research reveals some really nice patterns. We see here in green the recovery of, species richness in an old growth forest, and then the pastures have very low species richness. But once you've recovered forests in Colombia to about 30 years, we see a wholesale recovery of that biodiversity value. Now, species richness is a crude metric, so we need, of course, to be taking account of a variety of other ways of measuring diversity. Here we're looking at occupancy probability for several hundred species in Colombia and finding that there is no pattern between primary and pasture. But there's a wholesale, it's not really working, there we go, there's a wholesale recovery of occupancy probabilities of these species in a secondary forest. And then we have 40 very rare species in our data sets, and these are extremely rare and very usually absent in pastures, but they recover in very good numbers, to 83% of those species coming back. At similar occupancy probabilities. So this is great news. Across the tropical Andes and presumably elsewhere in the tropics, we can take away pastures and we can gain biodiversity benefits. But that's only part of the story. We need to think then how to promote restoration, and we need to bring in some other disciplines perhaps in doing that. Firstly, we could think about how we work with farmers to change their practices. They may be able to increase yields in some places, which is, I presume, how we're able to abandon so much land in Europe, and we can therefore create space for restoration. We can think about the global payment for ecosystem services agenda. Our work looking at that has shown that it'd be very cost effective in the Andes to restore pastures to forests at just $2 per ton of CO2. And we can also think about working with businesses. So our work focusing on major infrastructure, there's a risk of landslides, so it'd be much cheaper for companies to invest their capital in paying for forests to protect their infrastructure rather than for paying for the repairs. If we think about this sparing land for nature, we can increase our yields in some places and create space for nature elsewhere, and that will allow us to protect more biodiversity for both dung beetles and birds relative to a kind of more land sharing strategy where we mix these things together. So we can make space for restoration. And we would gain most of our species of conservation concern through doing that. So a quick summary: big biodiversity benefits of restoration. Secondary sparing would allow, by working with farmers to intensify in some places, can give us the space we need for nature. And then we have the potential for cost-effective mechanisms through payments for ecosystem services. But there are synergistic threats to restoration through other forces. Just as one example, this is some work we did on wildlife trade, showing that 24% of all terrestrial vertebrates are in trade. And those epicenters of trade tend to occur in the tropics, which is exactly where we're going to be focusing our global restoration targets. This global meta-analysis by my PhD student Oscar Morton reveals that where we have trade, we have 62% reduction in traded species in abundance relative to controls. And I think from a system perspective, then we're looking at impacts then on ecosystem functioning through pollination and seed dispersal, and ultimately then these may undermine our restoration recovery that we expect. So to conclude, a whole systems research approach is going to be required to identify and solve the risks to biodiversity from these multiple stressors. With that, many thanks, and I don't know what's happening with my keyboard, but sorry about the jumping. Thanks a lot, everyone.
Thank you very much, David. It looked very good and fine to me, so thanks for that. That's great. So thanks for the flavour from the University of Sheffield on some of your recent biodiversity research. I'd like to now pass the floor to a little bit further north to York University, to Jane Hill, who's going to give us a little flavour of some of the biodiversity research that she's been working with. Over to you, Jane.
Great, thanks very much, Ian. Thank you. Yeah, so many thanks for the invitation, and I thought I'd just present some of a personal perspective and also from some of my interactions with UKRI, thinking what the big challenges are for biodiversity and also from thinking about a systems approach. So as we've already been hearing, we need to be thinking about designing and creating landscapes that deliver on our net zero carbon commitments. They also produce sustainable food, promote nature recovery, and also support livelihoods. So clearly, to be able to achieve and tick off against all of those is a pretty complex issue. So I just thought I'd pick out a few things and think about how we deal with these to make sure that our biodiversity is protected and restored. I'm just going to pick out a few key issues as I see them. So the first thing is recognising that nature is dynamic and that we need to have landscapes and support biodiversity in an era of climate change. So we know that species are shifting. This is a meta-analysis by I-Ching Chen. I could have shown many other different examples, but basically showing that species are shifting as the climate is shifting. So we know that there's an association between the amount of shift and the amount of warming, but we also know that there's considerable variation among species. And one of the key drivers of that variation is the amount of habitat that's available in the landscape. So we all immediately need to be thinking about habitat availability to allow biodiversity to shift and respond to climate change. And so we're thinking about what sort of rules there might need to conserve natural habitats, which we know are highly fragmented. And we know that one of the key ways of conserving biodiversity in these fragmented landscapes is through conservation set-asides and protected areas. So thinking about the design of protected areas immediately brings us back to John Lawton and his DEFRA review 12 years ago, more, bigger, better and connected protected areas. So there are already some rules that we know we need to follow. More reserves are better, larger reserves are better, and so on. And you can use species area relationships to understand whether there are minimum sizes beyond which the area of a protected area is not going to be particularly helpful. And then this automatically brings us into issues about connecting up reserves and how connectivity is important, and also how the area around the protected area is important as well. So the matrix matters. This is just an example here. Again, I could have shown you many other examples of how understanding how the size of the protected area determines the amount of biodiversity that is supported. So this is some work from Jen Lucy in an oil palm landscape, but these species area relationships are common in fragmented landscapes. So moving on to thinking about connectivity then. So how can we bring connectivity into conserving biodiversity in these fragmented landscapes? And thinking about the degree to which improving connectivity is going to help species. And I think improving connectivity is something that the general public and policymakers get. They automatically understand the concepts. But what we've been showing is that actually there's a limited number of species that may benefit from connectivity. So trying to understand what those species may be is going to be important. So this is some work that Katie Threadgill did, looking at how how English agri-environment schemes through grassy field margins improve grassland biodiversity in England. And through these agri-environment schemes, she was able to show that they do improve connectivity, but these set-aside strips actually only had a few benefits for species with low dispersal, so probably those species that we most want to conserve that are most threatened. They didn't benefit those because they didn't connect the landscape up enough. And species that are already high dispersal were fine without them. So there was just this sort of intermediate group of species that benefits. And I think that's quite important when we're thinking about the effectiveness of improving connectivity. So what I just want to do is bring all these things together and see how, using a sort of conservation planning approach, we can incorporate all of these different multiple conservation goals into a single solution, and are there trade-offs, which we've already sort of heard a little bit about. And this was a piece of work we have been doing in Malaysia, in North Borneo, where the government is wanting to protect an extra 300,000 hectares of rainforest, trying to work out which areas of rainforest to increase the level of protection. So we collated a lot of environmental data and overlaid them and used a sort of systematic conservation prioritization approach to identify where those 300,000 hectares would be. So you can play around with these computer models and come up with solutions. And I guess the important thing in here was that we found that there were few trade-offs, which we found quite interesting. So we could maximize species richness while also maximizing connectivity. And I'd be quite interested to know whether this lack of a trade-off, if you like, is true in other landscapes, or it's something specific about this Borneo landscape. But I guess this is good news about being able to incorporate all of these into a solution. I just want to finish off thinking a bit more about UK policies and where there are lots of opportunities at the moment to boost and ensure biodiversity benefits if these new policies are operated appropriately. So we'll hear a lot about biodiversity net gain and offsets and biodiversity credits, and also thinking about whether the carbon offsetting plans will also have co-benefits for biodiversity, because there are huge win-wins there if that's the case. As with many other countries, the UK is committed to 30 by 30, but not really said where those areas are going to be. And through post-Brexit landscapes, we've now got environmental land management schemes and agri-environment payments, and see how they are going to deliver for biodiversity. I'm just going to finish off by saying, but we've not really spoken about how you actually quantify biodiversity and what that is, which metrics and which species. So a lot more complexity to some of the systems I've mentioned. So thank you very much for letting me contribute to this really interesting seminar.
Thank you very much, Jane. That was fascinating. I think the sounds from the little bits we've heard about UK biodiversity research and IIASA biodiversity research, there seems to be a lot of common interest and common, I think, complementary skills and techniques that we could all benefit from closer collaboration and closer working together. But in the interest of time, I need to keep this session moving. We're now going to move to the session that gives a platform for the Yasser NERC Fellows. We're very grateful for the Natural Environmental Research Council to fund their funding at the moment, 3 Yasser NERC Fellows. These gives opportunities for researchers who've completed their PhD to spend some time, they're funded to spend some time at Yasser and some time at their UK home university, and in this way to develop their research through jointly sitting both at Yasser and at home. And this is a platform for them to tell us a little bit about the work that they've been doing. And so the first Yasser NERC Fellow I'd like to introduce is Laura Graham, and she at Yasser is with the Biodiversity group, and she is with, so I'd like to pass the floor to you, Laura.
Thank you very much. Okay, so thank you for inviting me, and also thanks to the IIASA Collaborative Fellowship Programme for funding this research. So I'm going to talk about the effects of habitat fragmentation on biodiversity, and thankfully everyone previously to me have kind of outlined why this is important, because that's something I didn't have time to fit in. Okay, so my research was inspired by a recent debate in the literature around what the effect of fragmentation is on biodiversity. And just to clarify, by fragmentation, I'm talking about the effect of the spatial arrangement of remaining habitat once you've controlled for the effect of habitat loss. And so in the initial paper that sparked this debate, there was some talk about whether particular attributes of species or landscapes lead to positive or negative effects. And this wasn't necessarily answered in this paper. And I think it means that a kind of systematic approach is needed to gain this understanding. And in the second paper, which was arguing that perhaps actually the paper was maybe not fully outlining the problem, saying that correlative landscape scale studies might not actually be transferable. But then in response, there's the fact that experimental patch scale models might not actually scale up as expected. And to me, this kind of is an argument for taking a systems ecology approach to this problem. So with that in mind, my key research aims for this fellowship were to firstly gain a systematic understanding of how landscape structure influences biodiversity, and then to develop a process-based systems model, which actually allows us to fully explore that through kind of computer simulation experiments. So in terms of a systematic framework, what we really need to think about is what the landscape context is. So what is being fragmented? What is being fragmented by what the nature of the matrix is. Some information about the species which are actually being affected by this. And for my research, that tends to focus mainly on the kind of functional and response diversity. And then what scale these things are happening at. And to evaluate this, I've got two strands of research. The first of which is a meta-analysis which reviews the current literature on the effect of fragmentation on biodiversity and tries to set it into this framework. And then the second strand of this is a big data time series analysis. So then the second part of the second aim of the research, and this is what I will particularly be working on with IIASA, is around building a process-based model to explore some of these questions. And this essentially involves taking all of the different kind of processes which combine together at different scales to create the pattern in the response. So thinking about how the change leads to the pattern, how those patterns are linked to process, and then what the ecological response to that is. And then we can kind of examine this in different species traits, such as thinking about whether species are positively or negatively affected by edges in their habitat, or whether they have low or high survival in the matrix, depending on what that matrix is. So to conclude, firstly, to go back to the initial question of, is habitat fragmentation bad for biodiversity? I would say it depends, and I think we need a much more nuanced and structured approach to examining the question. In my initial findings from the meta-analysis, I find an overall positive effect of habitat fragmentation on biodiversity once you've controlled for the loss. But some initial kind of meta-regression around this suggests that it's very dependent on how you measure biodiversity. So are you measuring it as species richness or more kind of functional groups? And also the landscape context definitely make a difference. And then in terms of the system model of this biodiversity landscape structure relationship, it will allow us to gain a greater mechanistic understanding through doing these kind of computer simulation experiments, which let us kind of experiment with really broad scale habitat patterns in a way that you just can't do in reality, and see what effects those have. And then finally, there's scope, and I've had talks with the GloBiome team to build the results from this particular system model into, they have what called mosaic outputs from GloBiome, where they've got an idea of kind of percentages of different habitat types and different land use types that come out of the model. And then this can then be used to sort of downscale these to more kind of local advice. And that's the end of my talk, and I'd be really happy to chat to anyone who's interested in this research.
Thank you very much, Laura. We're going to move on. There's going to be opportunities. We'll explain a platform later where people can chat and get to know each other's research in more detail later on. But let's pass on to the second Yasser Connect fellow. This is Eleanor Warren Thomas. And she is also with the Biodiversity Group at IIASA, but also with the Integrated Biosphere Futures Group. So I'm going to pass the floor to you, Eleanor.
Thank you very much. Great, thank you very much for the introduction. Yes, so I'm Eleanor, and as highlighted already, I'm working between the Conservation Science Group here at Bangor University in the UK, and both the Biodiversity, Ecology and Conservation Group at IIASA and the Integrated Biosphere Futures Group, both of which sit in the Biodiversity and Natural Resources Programme. So for those of you who don't know me already, some of my previous research highlights have focused on understanding demand for natural rubber plantations as a sustained driver of deforestation in Southeast Asia. And that work's included cost-benefit analysis of forest conservation under carbon credit payments, and also some on-the-ground work, excuse me, examining potential trade-offs between biodiversity and production in tropical agricultural systems. And that's including smallholder rubber agroforestry and also the management of water tables in smallholder oil palm in Indonesia. So my fellowship research here at IIASA in Bangor works to understand some of the potential unintended consequences of meeting ambitious forest restoration targets nationally and internationally. So my core research question is around leakage or displaced demand for land that could arise from interactions between forest restoration initiatives and, excuse me, and drivers of deforestation. So the core research question here is there a risk that implementation of forest restoration initiatives to meet these ambitious targets could actually displace demand for land to the forest frontier? And this is particularly a pertinent question in countries where there's ongoing deforestation of old growth forest for agricultural land. So my first aim is to advance the use of scenario development and modelling techniques to project land use change futures, capturing multiple drivers of change and working at scales that are not only relevant globally when thinking about meeting global level demand for different commodities, but are also at local enough scales to be relevant to national and subnational decision making. So I'm working with two models. The first is GloBiome, which is a spatial partial equilibrium model of the agricultural, forestry and bioenergy sectors. And then also StockMod, which is a probabilistic model of deforestation processes. And I'm applying both of these models in the context of Colombia, where huge forest restoration commitments have been made, but where deforestation rates are changing rapidly following political and social changes, including a peace accord in 2016. So working with John Chavarro and Andres Peña, who've been tailoring GloBiome to the Colombian context as part of their work for the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network, we've been working to refine the GloBiome model for Colombia by including tailored national level data sets and also developing national policy-informed scenarios of forest restoration. And that's allowing us to assess the potential to meet growing demand for food, fuel and timber in Colombia, while also accounting for trade connections with the rest of the world, alongside scenarios of sustainable agriculture and deforestation control at the national level, and look at what happens to land cover and to production of agricultural and forestry products. So while these scenarios and outputs are really interesting, they do miss some realism by missing some critical non-market aspects of forest and land cover change. So the second model, StockMod, that I'm working with was developed by Isabel Rosa, honorary lecturer here at Bangor University. This can be used at much finer scales and works by projecting future land use transitions based on historical patterns and drivers. It was first developed to model deforestation, so it includes a spatial contagion effect, which is something that's been observed lots of times in deforestation frontiers. But it also provides uncertainty estimates. So it provides both more accurate projections of deforestation patterns, but also quantified uncertainties. So I'm working to adapt this model by including additional data on non-market drivers of forest loss. And I'm also working to adapt the model to project forest recovery as well as loss, and applying this to Colombia under multiple scenarios. And then my eventual work will be to bring StockMod and GloBiome together to interact with each other and to inform each other's findings, and also potentially include some local, global, local feedbacks in between the two modeling ecosystems. So my second core aim of this research is to assess the outcomes of these land use features for biodiversity. So for this, I'll be working closely with the Biodiversity Ecology and Conservation Group here at the IIASA, using state-of-the-art cutting-edge species distribution modelling approaches, and working closely with the Humboldt Institution in Colombia, who are developing species distribution models for threatened biodiversity there, to look at how these futures of restoration targets might actually affect biodiversity. Do you get net gain or net loss overall? So here are just some of the amazing collaborators making this work possible. Thank you to NERC for providing this collaborative fellowship funding, and please don't hesitate to get in touch if you want to find out more.
Thank you very much, Eleanor, for the introduction to your research. Sounds fascinating. And I will move to Chris Smith, who is the third Yasser Fellow at IIASA. He's with the Integrated Assessment and Climate Change Research Group at IIASA and with the University of Leeds in the UK. Over to you, Chris.
Okay, thank you very much for the introduction, Ian, and thank you also to NERC and IIASA for this opportunity. I am moving to a slightly different area of research. So I'm not a biodiversity expert, I'm a climate scientist. But I would argue that climate is very important for biodiversity and every aspect of the human Earth system. So my specialism really is in sort of the complex and the simple when it comes to climate modelling. So here on the right here is a picture of the Met Office's Monsoon supercomputer, and this is used to run the UK Earth system model, which is a sort of a full complexity atmosphere, ocean, carbon cycle climate model, and it has a spatial atmosphere and ocean, and sort of resolves those partial differential equations of moisture and energy and everything that we experience in the real world. But because of its complexity, it takes days to weeks to run one climate simulation, say from pre-industrial to the end of the 21st century. And with collaborators at Oxford University, I've developed a simple climate model, or also known as the emulator. And this can replicate, using particular parameter setups, the large-scale behavior of the more complex models. So you see here on this plot here in green, we've got the behavior of the UK Earth system model. And with a different parameterization, we can reproduce the large-scale behavior of the IPSL model, which is a French climate model. And there's about 60 or so of these climate models developed by modeling centers like the UK Met Office around the world. And for each of these models, we can develop a parameterization that replicates the behavior of these more complex models in about 1/10 of a second on a simple laptop. So I would challenge you. Oh, that didn't work. I had to sort of challenge you to sort of determine which one of those two is the emulator and which one is the Earth system model in those plots. So why are simple models useful? Well, I've already said that we can run sort of tens or hundreds of simulations per second. And because we can run our simulations so quickly using as a range of different parameterizations, so we can model the Earth with the UK model, we can model the French model, we can model lots of different climate models. We could also fill in the gaps. So these complex models are what we call an ensemble of opportunity. So we don't have sort of climate models that could reproduce every conceivable climate. And with this simplified model, we can actually produce projections that span that whole range of uncertainty. So this is on this figure on the right, which is one I prepared for the Carbon Brief blog. The grey band here is a sort of a range of projections that we can produce from one climate scenario. But what we can also do with these simple models is that we can actually use observations to narrow the range of projections based on some observable constraint. So here in blue, I've got the global mean surface temperature from 1850 to 2020. And we can use that plus its uncertainty to rule out some of these model projections that are very high. And in red here, you see some of the more complex models from CMIP6, and some of these models are warming too quickly or too slowly with respect to observations. So using these simplified models, we can create better projections that are consistent with observations. And these simple models as well, they're accessible. They sort of lower the entry level for getting involved in understanding climate science. So where this sort of comes into sort of more sort of a coupled and where this can be useful for biodiversity, well, the human influence on the climate and the Earth system is a chain of processes, and it starts with our emissions from fossil fuels and from land use change. And we can sort of replicate how the climate system behaves in response to that using sort of a simplified global mean model. But then we can look regionally. We can look at the regional climate change and the climate impacts and effects on climate variables that are important for biodiversity. So we can sort of again use our simple global emulator coupled to a more regional one. And then the idea is that we can, and where my work with IIASA comes in, is basically feeding these impacts back into the integrated assessment, the energy system model. So what effect does climate change and its impacts have on economy and human populations and currently modeled? And this is basically the crux of my work at IIASA. And Pierre has already pointed out the scenarios forum, and I also have a session that's related to this, and I'm sort of interested in advances in human Earth system interactions in scenario development, and the deadline for submission is today. Okay, so thanks very much for your attention. So just to summarize, simple models can be incredibly useful in reproducing the large-scale behavior of more complex systems in a fraction of the time. By linking simple models together, we can then project climate changes and then look at feedbacks and the relationships that matter in the Earth and human systems. And then we can derive projections of socioeconomic futures relevant for climate change. So thanks very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Chris, for the introduction to your work. Most appreciated. Now, one of the hardest things that we found during the pandemic is meeting and interacting with researchers around the world. It's one of the strengths of IIASA, our research network. And during this time, we launched an online platform called Yasser Connect to enable people to interact more, all from the comfort of their own home. And I'm going to ask my colleague Monica Bauer to tell us a little bit about this platform, because we think it would be really good for all of you to get interested in it and see if you'd like to use it. So Monica, can I pass to you, please?
Yes. Thanks, Ian. Do you see my slides?
Yes, yes.
Okay, great. So a few years ago, if someone would have asked me to share an image of what networking is or looks like, I would have shown something like this. But times have changed over the last few years, and today I find this image reflects more what it looks like today. It may have started with health concerns and travel restrictions, but we're also seeing how using online tools promotes sustainability, allows for more inclusiveness, where people participate from all corners of the globe, and practicality. But finding the right audience to make an impact is not always so easy. And that's why since 2019, IIASA has been developing its very own global systems analysis network, and we're calling it Yasser Connect. This exclusive platform brings together the Institute's community around topics of systems thinking. In the background here, you can see the map of our membership, which covers all 5 continents. All right, so what does that map represent? Well, to date, we have over 835 members from 70 countries. And last year alone, we saw over 1,800 interactions in this space. Okay, so why should you find this important? First of all, you can access the network, which at the moment is 20% staff, 50% alumni, and 30% national members and collaborators. There's also options to directly message colleagues in the network and on the platform. You can join events. We've hosted 2 of our regional conferences and also launched 2 event series here. And you can also share your events. So the next time you're speaking or hosting an event, let others in our network know. Also, you can share professional opportunities. So for example, calls for applications, calls for abstracts, job opportunities, and your current projects. And all of this is through a targeted approach. So for example, if there's a position open at your organization for someone in biodiversity or an upcoming event on the topic, you can share it and notify colleagues working in that specific research area. Also, you can join communities of practice. So for example, here we're building a community around biodiversity. When engaging various stakeholders, co-creation is key, and that's no different here. So for example, we want to continue the conversation started here today regarding biodiversity and welcome everybody to join our biodiversity group in Yasser Connect. So you can share updates, start conversations, ask questions, and engage with fellow experts in this field. And there's also more information in our UK regional group as well that may be of interest, including the funding opportunities mentioned earlier today. So let us know if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. We're also hosting monthly training and drop-in sessions. So join us today. It's super easy. We're sharing the link in the chat, and from there you can request to join and let us know you're joining because of today's event. Thank you for your time, and we're looking forward to seeing you and continuing conversations on Yasser Connect.
Thank you very much, Monica, for that introduction to Yasser Connect. I'd very much strongly encourage people to have a look at Yasser Connect. It's a great tool, and it will certainly help all of us connect very well. I'm afraid we've run out of time today, but before we finish, I would like to say a big thank you to all our speakers for giving some excellent presentations about their work. And for keeping to the timeline. I'm afraid we didn't give you much time, but you did a sterling job in presenting parts of your research very briefly for the whole audience. So thank you very much. Thank you very much to the audience for joining us. Thank you for putting your questions in the chat and the Q&A. I think we managed to answer most of them. Thank you very much for joining us. We look forward to seeing you at future events, and we look forward also to see you in Yasser Connect. Good luck, everybody, with your research about biodiversity, and we always encourage to look at biodiversity from a systems perspective. Thank you very much, and goodbye.